Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, wa salatu wa salam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi ajma'in wa min ba'd. Welcome everyone in this webinar entitled The Board Impact of Family Business. We in the family or the National Center for Family Business welcome everyone, and we hope that you can get benefited from this webinar. Let me first give you a glimpse about the National Center of Family Business. It was launched in implementation of a royal decree dated September 2012. The center works to achieve its mission by providing services and effective communication with family businesses, which is the most important part, the government agencies, advisories, and the community and the general public in order to build an integrated system that contributes to the enhancement and the sustainability of the family businesses. As we know, the family businesses here in Saudi Arabia represents 66%, 2/3 of the private sector's GDP, and employ 76% of its workforce. Our guest today, Dr. Jay Bevington, is a senior. As you can see here, he has a lengthy and enriched resume. He's a senior partner at Deloitte Middle East. He's a board advisory leader, advising more than 500 corporate, family businesses, government, and public sector boards with more than 20 years of experience in this field. He got his doctorate from University of Edinburgh, and his thesis was about organizational change and learning. This webinar tonight, inshallah, it was based on 2 articles published by Deloitte, and we already made these articles available in our social accounts, in our website, and we hope everyone can access them and read them. They are very valuable. And so this presentation is based on these 2 articles published by, as I mentioned before, Deloitte. And what's unique about these articles, that it came from Deloitte, who has a large experience in this field. And they came up with a set of recommendations and framework to make the board or the family board more effective. As we know that the board in general, either by the usual or the regular, let's say, companies, or the family business companies, are similar in their responsibilities. They are a tool to implement governance, so there are similarity between them. However, the board in the family business face a range of additional challenges which make their job more difficult and more complex. The success of the family business can be attributed to many factors, like let's say the reputation, the market condition, and highly talented CEO or founder, and also effective board. In this presentation, we're going to investigate the role of family boards and presents a framework for understanding if they are, let's say, giving valuable advices, or they are delivering value for their owners and stakeholders. And we are going to see how can we assess the impact of the boards. So without further ado, we want to welcome Dr. Jay, and welcome, Dr. Jay. And if you have any questions, please write them down, and we are gonna discuss them later after the presentation is done. So welcome, Jay, and we are looking forward to hear from you.
Thanks, Al, and good evening. Good evening, everybody. It's I was wondering how many people were going to turn up, given that Newcastle is playing Manchester United in the cup final. So those of you who have turned up, thank you very much indeed. So I wanted just to open with some remarks about based on my experience of working with many boards, including family boards, and really just to help people understand where the board impact framework came from and why it's important. So as Sahel said, thank you very much for the introduction. I've worked now with hundreds of boards over many years, and boards from different sectors, different industries, in different types of maturity as well, from startups to mature businesses and businesses that are transforming, and also businesses that are in some form of crisis. And there's probably three key findings or three learnings that I've had over that 20-year period. I know the first is that often boards will confuse their own effectiveness with that of the business. So if the business is doing particularly well, and is being very successful and is growing and is delivering shareholder value, that there is a kind of an automatic assumption that the board must be doing a good job. Now, of course, that may be true, but it is an assumption, I think, that needs to be debated and needs to be explored. The second thing that I've observed and found over many years is the way board effectiveness reviews are done. Board effectiveness reviews have been around now for about 10 or 15 years. And often those reviews will look at inputs. So they will look at things like board composition, they will look at board agenda items, they may look at the committee structure. Now, these things are important, don't get me wrong, but they don't necessarily look at things like impact and outcomes. And the final thing I'd say is that over those years, I've found that boards often are seen as not particularly value-adding by management. That management see governance and see board meetings and board level committees as something that needs, they need to get through. It's if you like, it's a hindrance rather than something that adds value to the business. So what we've tried to do with the board impact framework, which I'll take you through in a second, is to actually turn all that on its head and say, okay, what is it if the board itself was adding value, what would we be seeing? Rather than, the business being successful and shareholders, if you like, and family members getting more value, what actually would we observe and notice about that board? And how can boards ultimately add more value to management? But before we do that, Sahel, if you want to go on to the next slide, just, if we're going to work out how boards can add value and how ultimately they can make a difference and contribute positively to family businesses and ultimately to the wider family, then we need to be clear what their role is. And, very often I find, and in particular in the kingdom, I find that governance is often portrayed as being about compliance. It might be seen as being about control or regulation. Now, of course, again, those things are important. But for me, good governance is actually about strategy. It's about leadership. It's about culture, and it's about talent, as well as it's about oversight and regulation and control. So we've pulled together really three broad areas of when we're looking at a board, when we're looking at a family board in particular, what are the three aspects or the three roles of that board? And as you can see on the screen, we're talking really about stewardship, oversight, and accountability. Ultimately, in my view, a family board is there to do two things. It's there to protect and safeguard the legacy of the family, but also make sure that that business is sustainable in the future. So it needs to be, the board needs to be attentive to aspects like talent and the culture of the business. It needs to be clear that there is a strategy there. It needs to be clear about how values in the organization are being lived. It needs to be clear about its own effectiveness and its own impact as a board. It also needs to oversee the work of management, and it needs to do that in a way that they seek assurance, the board seeks assurance on management performance, on KPIs, on whether regulations are being complied with, and of course ultimately evaluates the overall performance of the CEO. And then finally, a very important role of a board, and in particular in the case of family businesses, is this notion of accountability. You know, to whom is the board accountable? Now, obviously, a lot of family businesses these days have family offices or family councils, but being very clear where and to whom is the board accountable and how does it discharge that accountability is key. So having good relationships with stakeholders, not just the family itself, being open and transparent about performance of the business, but also ultimately performance of the board and effectiveness of the board is absolutely key. So when we're working with family businesses, we would look very much through the lens of stewardship, oversight and accountability, and how those three roles ultimately enable the board to preserve and safeguard legacy and also sustainability. Somebody's on. Right, is that just me? I had lots of background noise. Yeah, and ultimately the sustainability of the business. So, Hal, did you want to?
Yeah. So, Dr. This is a good introduction, actually, for the three roles of the boards. So, how can you differentiate between the roles of the boards in the family business and the roles of the, let's say, the boards in regular companies? As we know that if you are a board member in a family business, you are facing certain challenges that more pronounced. And how can you decipher these conflicts and how can you manage them? So what are the differences, that, let's say, the nuances between the two rules?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, legally, you know, from a legal perspective, there are no differences. So you have, you know, the board of a family business, you know, has the same kind of rules, regulations, if you like, compared to other boards. But my experience of working with family boards is they do have some challenges that they tend to be grappling with and juggling more than their kind of non-family board counterparts. So very often we end up talking to family businesses about succession planning, for example. You know, succession planning through the business, succession of the CEO, succession potentially of the chairman themselves. You know, very often the founder of the business, the very successful business, will be the chairman himself. And sometimes that can lead to issues whereby the chairman is effectively acting as the CEO, which can be very, you know, disempowering of the CEO. So I would say there are kind of dynamics on a family board that we do see on other boards, but they're more pronounced and they're more acute, if you like, in a family business. There's also obviously the kind of the generational shift. So, looking at sort of third or fourth generation family members, they may have, different priorities or different ambitions, if you like, compared to, to the founding family members, and, taking time to understand those and, help ultimately the board and the chair through those issues, I think is something that we spend quite a lot of time on. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, perfect.
So if we look, if we just look at this notion then of board impact. So, as I said, lots and lots of work on board effectiveness over many years, and it tends to be very input focused, and doesn't always look actually at what is the difference that this board is making. And one of the best ways to consider that, to analyze that, is to talk to management and to talk to key shareholders and key stakeholders. So we pulled together this framework. It goes from level -1, which, to be clear, is a board that is potentially destroying value. So a board that actually, unfortunately, is not adding any value at all. In fact, is detracting value. Level 0 board, which can be quite a passive board. So this is a board that really, constitutionally, we need to have, we need to have the board in place, but actually the workings of that board is not adding a huge amount. It's not making a positive difference to management. And this is, again, from a family business or family enterprise position, where we see, a number of family, we see a number of boards in this particular space. And this can be quite often, because the chairman themselves is quite dominant. Now, as we know with board governance is about acting with group authority. A board acts as a body, as a governing entity. It's not the wishes or the ambitions or the directions of one man or one woman. So in the case of a level 0 board, we often find that the board itself is not acting as that counterweight, that potentially that brake to the chair or indeed the CEO or the management team. So there isn't always the scrutiny of board proposals or management proposals. There isn't the challenge, if you like, of actions or decisions that the chairman in particular might want to make. So that's a level 0 board. It's a passive board, so it's not stopping management from doing things inappropriately so, but it's not actually accelerating the business or enabling the business to grow and to be better. Now, if we just move on to the next slide, Sahel. So this is where we have boards that are starting to add a lot of value. And as you can see here, we talk about level 1 and we talk about level 2 boards. So to be clear, a level 1 board is a board that is very good, going back to the roles of a board. It's very good at scrutiny and oversight. So this is a board that challenges management and scrutinizes management well. It does it effectively. It does it constructively. So the CEO and their team know that they will be challenged, and therefore they prepare well for board or committee meetings. They, they answer questions well because they can, again, they can sort of prepare around those. So this is a board that is adding value. But it's not necessarily a board that is really helping to drive the business forward and helping the business to grow. And that's because, really the board tends to be focused on KPIs. It might be more focused on perhaps compliance and regulation. It might not set its own agenda. So the board agenda comes predominantly from management. And there is a sense of kind of hierarchy on this board, despite the fact that the board doesn't necessarily own its own agenda. Management will often say to me, they feel that they are reporting into the board rather than it being a partnership or a collaboration. And this is very much a level 2 board. So, this is a board that's great at oversight, but it's also very, very good at stewardship, right? So it's great at protecting the family's legacy. It is also actively discussing and debating aspects of sustainability. How can the business grow successfully? How can it adapt? How can it, modify its approach in an agile way in order to continue to be successful and to deliver value and deliver wealth to the wider family? So this is the board. When I speak to the CEO and when I speak to the management team, they will give me stories of where the board has really helped them to think through issues or dilemmas or challenges. They will give me examples of where the board has potentially offered networks and contacts to management to help them progress items of business. So this is a board that's working very well and collaboratively with management, very respectful, of management. And it will be a board that when I look at the board agenda, it's an agenda that is shaped by the board, owned by the board, and it will contain important topics, obviously like strategy, but it will talk about ESG, for example. It will talk about culture and succession planning and talent management within the organization. So this is a board that's looking at the sort of softer aspects of organizational success, as well as the harder, financial metrics and risk metrics that might be used. So that's obviously the place that we want our family boards to get to in terms of a level 2 board. And then if we just look at, we've shared here our board effectiveness framework. And again, this is something that colleagues on the line are very, can use if helpful. So if you just go to the next slide, please, Sahel.
Just before that, I have two questions here about level 2. So you mentioned that in this level that the board actively seek to have let's say, or to introduce external expertise. So can you elaborate on that? How can we get external expertise? How can we determine the appropriate one, which one to bring into the boards? How can we evaluate them? I think because there is I think what's called the consultants or consulting boards, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, there are very, okay, so great question. I mean, let's start with the principle, right? So the principle of having access to expertise that is not on the board is fundamentally sound, right? So one of the things I will always do is I will take the organization's strategy, I will take the family business's risks, and I will look at the strategy, and I'll look at the risks, and I will see how does the board, the composition of the board, help the family business progress its strategy and manage and mitigate the risks, right? So that is a basic question that I will always ask and always work on with every single board. Doesn't matter whether it's family business or not. Now, obviously, what I want to see on that board is skills and knowledge and networks that will help the family business achieve its strategy and mitigate its risks. If I don't see that, then I'd like to see a strategy where the board actively seeks external expertise. Now, it can do that in a number of ways. It can do that through introducing independent board members onto the board. I think if you get the right independent board members, they can be phenomenal and they can have an incredible impact. I appreciate a Deloitte board is not a family board, but it is a partnership board, and there are some similarities. Deloitte introduced independent board members about 8 or 9 years ago, and it's had a transformational impact. But they have got to be the right people, the right board members. The other thing I see is advisory boards, shadow boards. Sometimes shadow boards are used to develop talent, develop family members for potential board positions. But having an advisory board, I do a lot of work with NEOM, for example, and they have an advisory board that sits alongside the main NEOM company board. And I also think, going back to the board agenda, I'm going to want to see external experts coming in and talking to the board. If you're worried about, the next generation, get a business professor in to talk about, demographic and generational shifts. Just make sure that you are accessing, the right expertise.
Nice, excellent. This is a really excellent point. The last point here in this slide: succession planning and preparing family members for future board membership, which is an active priority. The idea of shadow board and how can we integrate the next generation and give them some kind of accountability, and how can they hold some responsibilities. Excellent, Dr. J.
Yeah, so this was the kind of the board effectiveness framework that I briefly mentioned. So this is a framework we've used for about 15 years now. So it stood the test of time. And as you can see, we've got the 3 roles of a board at the center, and then around the edges we've got the aspects of a board that ultimately determine whether it will be effective and whether it will be impactful and operate at that level 2 board. And as you can see, I won't go through all of these, but we start with board composition and talent. Do we have the right people sat around the board table? I once worked with an incredibly prominent family board, and again, the children sat on the board alongside the founder and his wife, but they had 3 independent board members. This was a very, very, very successful global business, and it had interests in property. It had interests in land, and those independent board members would provide expertise in those very specialist and very focused areas. So, do we have the right people on the board? And if we don't, how can we get them? How can we build a bridge? Stakeholder engagement is incredibly important with family businesses. You may have seen in the articles that we have published, we talk about this important role of stakeholder advocacy. So the family members of the board having a critical role in being that bridge to the wider family, making sure that the work of the board is talked about and discussed with the wider family, but also the wishes, the desires, and any issues that wider family has are also brought in and reflected, in the boardroom. Going right the way around to board tone and dynamics, incredibly important that the board, going back to level 2 board, it will have an appropriate balance between trust and support of management on the one hand, and challenge and holding to account on the other. And that will be often issue by issue. So it's very important that the tone at the very top in the boardroom is constructive and is positive. And then finally, through to good old the chair. We're just about to publish a 3rd article in the series on the chair. 70% of an effective, impactful board is the chair, but also 70% of an ineffective board is the chair as well. It is an absolutely critically important role, and ensuring that the chair, understands that and behaves accordingly is paramount. So that is our board effectiveness framework. Happy to talk much longer on that, but I think we need to move on.
Yeah, thank you. So just before moving on about the dynamics, the board tone, and you talked about challenging the idea, because some of the board members, if they feel that it's an environment of trust, they can express their idea, come up with innovative, bold ideas also, and they can convey their, let's say, vulnerabilities or so if it's an environment of trust, if we lack this kind of environment, the board, as you mentioned, will lack all these valuable inputs from the board members. And I think this is a good segue to the other slide. How can we make the board member more impactful?
Yeah, so this really touches on our 2nd article of the 2 that we've published, and this talks about the attributes of effective and impactful board members. So, it is very true that we do need every board member to be adding value, right? As I've said, I've worked with hundreds of boards, and it's very rare to find every single member of a board adding value and having a positive impact on the overall effectiveness of the board. But this is something that we need to work towards, and we have pulled together this model that talks about 3 aspects of effective board members. And as you can see on this slide, this talks about very much we start with business credibility. So the board member is on the board for the right reasons. They are on for their skills, for their knowledge, for their network, and for those skills and knowledge and network to reflect ultimately the business that the family enterprise is in and the sector that they operate in. But having that business credibility isn't enough. And if you just want to go to the 2nd slide, we also we need board members to have an appropriate personal style. So what I mean by that is how they deliver their contributions at board level, the questions that they ask, the opinions that they share. They need to do that in a way that is engaging and that engenders trust and safety at board level. We know a lot from the psychology of coaching that, you know, you're often better asking a question than making a statement. And also you're better keeping the jargon and, you know, the management speak to an absolute minimum, so every single member of that board can understand what you're talking about. So personal style and business credibility are important, but you can have both of those and still not really add a huge amount of value, which brings us to the third and the final slide around contextual understanding. And this is very simply that, is the board member spending sufficient time getting to know the business, getting to know the board, really understanding the context, the environment within which the family business is operating? Now, I'm absolutely not saying that board members should interfere with management. What I am saying is that for a board member to add value, to ask questions that start to affect positive change and to influence the mindset of management, they do need to understand the business. They need to understand how it's structured. They need to understand the culture of the business, you know, what's working, what's not working. And when they have that contextual understanding, they can be far more impactful. Yeah, I'll stop there. I was going to say something else, but I'll stop there. So thanks, Sahel.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you a lot. So please, if you have any questions, you can write them down. We have two questions from one from Sarah, and she is asking about the effect of female presence in the boards. So are they contributing differently? What's your idea or experience about this, Doctor?
So we've got a long way to go, right? We have got, you know, globally, we still have a long way to go in terms of female representation on boards. There is no doubt, you know, from a scientific perspective, from a research perspective, having female board members makes a hugely positive difference to the board and its effectiveness. We know, I mean, there are lots of diversity, different categories and of diversity, but we know from research that gender is probably the most important. So having female board members and having as balanced a board as possible from a female and male perspective adds huge value. I've said that from a research perspective, but also from an experience perspective. You know, I find that very often the way female board members will contribute, the questions that they will ask, that they tend to be, you know, more varied, if you like, in terms of covering more topics. They tend to be, you know, generally more sensitive in terms of the culture of the business. So, you know, certainly from my experience of working with, you know, quite a significant number of female board members, including on family boards, it's you know, from my perspective, absolute no-brainer. We need it.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, one of my friend, he's working on his thesis right now. He is not here, so I'm gonna talk about it. I hope he won't hear me. So his thesis is about the effect or the impact of the female presence in the board, and the dependent variable in his thesis is the risk measured by the variability or the volatility of the earnings. And actually, he found that the presence of the female in the board will decrease the risk by 30%. But there is, let's say, an optimal ratio of the female presence in the board. They have to reach a certain percentage, which is, let's say, 30%. So to reach the third, so in this area, they will have this effect. And maybe you can explain this, because I think in any environment, if it's only one voice, the voice will disappear. But if there is let's say a collective of voices, the voices will be heard eventually. So if you have a percentage of female, and the female, as we know, according to the science, they are more risk averse and they are more attentive to a lot of issues. So they will decrease the risk. Or this is his explanation in his paper. It's still a working paper, but it's interesting that they gonna have an effect on the risk reduction in the organizations itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, look, this is always about, board composition. It's always about balance, right? So, any group, any board, any team that I've worked with over my career that is homogenous, is just single gender, there can be problems, right? So I remember many years ago working with a group of plastic surgeons. They were all men. There were many problems with that group, with that team. I also remember working about 22 years ago with a department of midwives in a hospital. There were 40 midwives, and of course they were all women. And that also had lots and lots of problems, right? So I think having a fair and equal representation of the genders on boards is absolutely essential. But it shouldn't stop there. We have age profiles which are important. Having the younger generation on boards, I think is key. Having people with expertise in the business, but also having people that are outside of the business. Might have expertise in cybersecurity or environmental issues or whatever. So having as diverse a board as possible is always the goal that we're looking for in my view.
Thank you, Dr. J. So this is another question from Nader. He's saying, is there a difference between Saudi or the GCC in general, boards and other, in terms of board structure, culture? Because you mentioned that maybe the last slide about the organization, that you have to be attentive to the culture and the customs. So is there any differences between, let's say, the board composition, any differences between the GCC and the other countries?
So I think, it's a great question, and I get asked it quite a lot, actually. I did a similar webinar only last week for alumni from Harvard and from INSEAD, and from other kind of leading business schools, and that question came up, and I've done some work for PIF, for the Centre for Governance at PIF, where we looked into this. Are there differences between Saudi boards and either other boards in the Middle East or the boards generally? Now, what I would say is that from that there are generally, globally, that there are predominantly two governance models that are used. You have the model that is used in the Middle East, which is called a supervisory board or a two-tier board governance model. So this is where you have obviously a management board that is headed up by the CEO, and then you have a supervisory board made up of, for example, family members, people that are not directly involved in the business on a day-to-day basis. So that's the kind of two-tier model. Very, very, very common in the Middle East. Common in the US as well. And then in sort of Western Europe, we have something called the unitary board. The unitary board is a board that surprisingly is unitary in nature. So it has both management and non-executive directors on the board. But the non-executives are always in the majority. So you'll have a non-executive chairman, you will have usually 4 or 5 non-executive directors, and then you will have the CEO, usually the CFO, could be the chief operating officer as well, the coup. So you have management in the boardroom, making decisions, with the board. So obviously the Saudi model, it tends to be the first, and that is a model that you share, with the rest of the Middle East, be that UAE or Qatar or other Middle Eastern countries. Where I would say Saudi is different, I think there's something about there are a number of things that I would say. There's something very compelling about the passion that Saudis have for the kingdom and for the 2030 vision. So, motivation, commitment is not a problem in Saudi Arabia, in from what I've seen, working with boards, working with executives, and working with family businesses in Saudi Arabia. Now, what I would say, I always like to be honest, that there is an issue of overboarding, right? So what do I mean by that? I mean that, the senior Saudis that I know tend to sit on many, many boards and many, many committees. There is a very rough guidance in Europe which talks about there is a formula, but if you're not a chair and if you're not a CEO, if you are a board member, then you should not sit on any more than sort of five boards or committees. If it's the chairman, if you are the chairman, then it's 3. If you're the CEO, then it's 2, right? So it gets kind of progressively more difficult. Now, I do know some Saudi nationals that sit on 70 or 80 different boards and committees, right? So there's an issue of how can you be effective when you're spread across 70 or 80 different, governance forums? And of course, those Saudi nationals tend to rely on advisors, for example. So there's an issue with, and that's just a very, very practical issue, right? The kingdom is growing exponentially, right? It's transformational what's happening in Saudi Arabia. Every time royal decrees and another mega project, they all need to be governed and they need to be led, and therefore the sort of there's not enough senior Saudis to go around, right? Or experienced senior Saudis to go around. So that's why the issue is there. The issue is there for good reasons. For positive reasons. It's about the kingdom doing well and the kingdom progressing and transforming. I think just two other points quickly. I've mentioned overboarding. I've also briefly mentioned, I do see with Saudi boards, perhaps more so, or not perhaps, more so than I see with other boards, the presence of the chairman tends to be very strong. That they can be, a dominant force. They can be a strong personality in the boardroom. Now, that might not be a problem, but it is a problem from a governance perspective, because going back to what I said earlier on, the board should act with group authority. And if the board members themselves will not challenge the chairman, then we've got a problem. I'm not saying the chairman is a bad person or anything like that. I'm just saying that governance works well when there is that open, honest, and everybody feels they can challenge everybody at board level, including the chairman. And I think the third point is the point I've already made about diversity. I think I would like to see more more sort of female representation on Saudi boards. There are young, actually, from the boards I've worked with in Saudi, there are young members of the board, right? So maybe age isn't a huge isn't a huge issue compared to other countries. But I would like to see more female representation.
Excellent, Dr. J. So our last question, I think, from Jason Clark. Thank you for the presentation. Question to Dr. Bevington. How do you see the difference between boards and their members to family enterprise that are still focused on the operational business, and those family enterprises that are looking to diversify beyond the core businesses, either post-IPO or looking to diversify for intergenerational planning? For example, moving to a more diversified family office arrangement. Thank you, Jason.
So I think that comes down to I think that's about two things in my view. First of all, is the point I think we've already talked about board composition. So making sure there are the right people on the board, and to be honest, boards and organizations are not static; they are dynamic and they are constantly evolving. So as a board, if I understand the question correctly, as the board, goes in different directions and, potentially, goes into new lines of business, then, the board itself needs to change. These big mega projects, we don't necessarily expect the leadership to be the same at the end or halfway through a mega project than it is at the start. I think it's often the same for boards. We need to evolve and change the board membership depending upon the tasks at hand, right? That the strategy, the markets that the business is operating in, the issues and the risks it's facing. But the second point I'd make is, I made the point about 70% of an effective board is the chairman and 70% of an ineffective board is the chairman. I'll make a second point in relation to that. Effective boards start with effective executive management, right? And what I mean by that is, the information, the papers that management provide to the board will greatly determine the quality of the dialogue and quality of the debate. So, if we've got a very operational board and we want that board to be more strategic, then the information that management is supplying to the board needs to be more strategic. It needs to be less KPI focused. It needs to be less in the detail. So I would start by looking at what is the information the board is receiving. How does it receive that information in terms of the presentations potentially that the board is listening to from management, and making those more diversified and more strategic in nature.
Yes. Okay, I really appreciate your valuable contribution, Doctor, and I have learned a great deal from you, actually. So thank you again. And also, I want to thank all the attendees for attending this webinar, and thank you for dedicating this time for us in this webinar. And we are looking forward to see you again in our future events. So we want to thank you and see you.
No
again.
problem. Thank you. Take care, everybody. Thank you for joining.
See you.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.